Hello, my name is Nicholas Morgan, and I'm an editor at Ahval News, and this is Turkey Abroad. Joining me now is Wladimir van Wilgenberg. He is a journalist and analyst on Kurdish politics, and he is currently in Erbil. Wladimir, thank you for your time.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So there's been a lot of speculation recently that Turkey was preparing for another offensive in northeastern Syria, and analysts were debating whether it was likely before or after, or whether Trump left office or not. And a lot of analysts were basing it off the fact that this week we started seeing Russian soldiers setting up positions close to Inisa, which is on one corner of the zone they allowed Turkey to seize back in October last year, and more reinforcements being sent to Turkey's proxies in the region. But then some analysts were of the opinion that if Trump is on his way out and Turkey's looking to build some inways with the new Joe Biden administration, then they're probably not going to attack in Syria. So do you get the impression right now that the SDF and the autonomous administration is expecting a Turkish attack, or are they just preparing for the worst case scenario?
Well, I mean, they never rule out any Turkish attack, so they always prepared for the worst case scenario, as you said. And also there were some, not like confirmed, but like some reports claiming that there's some new agreement between the Russians, the regime, and the SDF for Ain Issa, so that Turkey doesn't attack that, to have some joint points in the Ain Issa area, which they had before also. So I'm not sure what's exactly going on in Ain Issa. But yeah, as you mentioned also, is that for Turkey it would not be good to start on such a bad note or page with the Americans. So there were some people were saying that, yeah, maybe Trump would allow Turkey to attack during the transition period. But you also see, actually, especially from the Turkey, you see like some signals that they want to show that maybe they could, like make amendments and stuff. You also see Turkey talking to the Saudis, and Turkey, Erdogan is talking about like some new economic project or something. Like he fired one senior official. So I mean, I don't know. Like probably for Turkey, it would probably not be a very good idea now to attack. But what we do see is that since the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict has been decided for the moment, is that you see like a huge increase in attacks around the Ain Issa area for the last week or 2 weeks, something like that. You see a huge increase. So that's why there started to be speculation of, but most of the time it's like the usual mortar attacks. So it's not like something, but there was some fighting between SDF and rebel fighters, because they have said they killed a number of fighters, and actually they even had a exchange of bodies. So I mean, I personally think now probably will not see a Turkish intervention, but you never know. Like there could always be another Turkish invasion in northeastern Syria, because you see speeches of Erdogan mentioning the northeast all the time, like talking about the terror corridor and this kind of stuff. So I mean, you never know with Turkey, but at the same time, I mean, Turkey needs economic recovery and not more issues. So they have enough problems to deal with. So that's the situation, I think.
Well, recently I saw that you had an interview with Salim Muslim of the PYD, and he was saying that for the Syrian regime and then the opposition based in Turkey, they're still very much against the idea of including more like Kurdish rights in the constitutional talks. And of course, Turkey effectively has a veto over the opposition located on its territory, and the Syrian regime has consistently been against granting this kind of autonomy to the Kurdish region. So what I want to ask you is, because I've also seen reports that there has been some frustration with U.S. and Russian efforts to get some progress on this issue in parts of northeast Syria. But what at this point is the point of further negotiation? What is the goal for the autonomous administration, and when it comes to speaking to the regime? Is it simply to, at this point, prevent Turkish attack, or buy more room for diplomacy on the autonomy issue. What's the status there, in your view?
Well, I mean, recently there were no more direct talks with the Syrian government on autonomy and this kind of issues. I mean, there have been some de facto mediation efforts by the Russians recently, but that's more focused on preventing a Turkish attack, as you mentioned. So I think they sort of they know that Damascus is not very much willing to make any concessions, because the problem for the SDF is that Damascus is just basically waiting for the US to leave. So they know that US probably at some point could leave. So they have like this card in their hand, like they don't need to make an agreement now. And also General Maslum Abdi, the commander-in-chief of the SDF, he told International Crisis Group recently that during October 2019 events, that only after the regime realized that the Americans would still stay in northern Syria, that only then that they were interested in making a sort of deal to prevent Turkey to take more land. So I think that's one of the issues, that the regime is quite, like the Russian support is basically endless. I mean, sometimes the Russian support is more or less, but in the end, like the Russian support is there. So it's not like, for instance, with the US, it's US saying we're just there to fight ISIS. We don't care about Syrian rebels, opposition, SDF. I mean, they don't really have a political project, you could say. So that's like the problem for the SDF, is that they have this issue of non-recognition. And it's different, for instance, from the Iraqi Kurds that have like a recognition in the Iraqi constitution, which also took a lot of time to negotiate that with Iraqi opposition factions at the time. So, I mean, that's why it's a bit difficult for SDF to maneuver. So that's why they're really trying anything to get some form. So, for instance, also they went to Moscow to meet with this sort of pro-Russian small opposition party, and they signed some form of a memorandum of sort of agreement. So you always see that they're trying to do something still, despite of the oil deal with the US and the US presence. They also try to keep their relations there with the Russian regime, because now you have also a Russian presence in a large area. Like, well, before US was present in almost all northern Syria. I mean, after October 2019, Americans are only in Deir ez-Zor and Hasaka. So all the other areas, including a very important city of Kobani, is basically under de facto protection of the Russians. So they have like a Russian military base close to Kobani. So that's a little bit the problem for the SDF. So that's why they try to keep their other channels open. But also at the same time, they don't want to lose the US, because the US sort of provides a counterbalance towards the Russians, and also in the talks with the regime, it gives like the SDF more power, basically, because of the American support, they still control the oil resources, for instance, and they can still continue operations against ISIS sleeper cells. So I think the situation is a bit complicated, but the problem for them is that they don't have a guarantee, and that's why they're also always asking to be part of this Geneva talks, because recently there were talks again, and they're talking about the constitution between the Syrian opposition, Syrian government, and civil society organizations. But so far, because of this Turkish veto, they were always excluded from the Geneva talks. I think they were involved somehow in the Cairo talks, but not in the Astana and the Geneva talks. And there's always a way to get them in through civil society or something. There's always a way to get them in, but Turkey is really blocking it, because Turkey knows that if they are not part of these negotiations, if there's ever an agreement, which I find unlikely, then I mean, it would exclude them and basically deny them legitimacy and also threaten their future. So that's why it's always the situation is a bit unclear. But of course, with the incoming Biden administration, I don't think he's going to leave Syria anytime soon. So I mean, at least the next four years, we're going to see some more, because Biden is not going to be like Trump every time saying, okay, I'm going to withdraw. So I mean, that's like one of the biggest problems that the SDF and the Syrian Kurds had with the Trump administration, because one day they're like the Syria team or the administration convinces Trump to stay, but then the next few months, then Trump is going to say, well, what we're doing in Syria. So I think with Biden, that's going to be a little bit more clearer policy on Syria and northern Syria, at least.
Yeah, well, we can move over into Joe Biden now, because he's going to be coming into office in January, and he was of course opposed to Trump's decision to withdraw from Syria at the same time as being very vocal against Erdogan through his campaign for the presidency. And now he's beginning to name members of his national security team. We already have Anthony Blinken, who wants to nominate to be Secretary of State, Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, and most recently retired General Lloyd Austin to head the Pentagon. With these kind of choices, and just the fact that he at least signals more consistency in a U.S. position, do you think Biden's going to be able to provide that kind of confidence to Syrian Kurdish officials that they're going to maintain this U.S. support or achieve any breakthroughs or have any new leverage when it comes to Turkey's position relative to them?
Well, I'm sure that one of the things that they're going to tell people like Rayburn or others is that, I mean, their main issue is that, like the previous, still the current Syria team, they were like telling before, like, we can't do anything if Turkey invades. We're not going to stop Turkey. It's a NATO ally. And they were talking, remember in October 2019, there was this talk of sanctions and stuff. But in reality, there were not much sanctions. So I'm sure that the local officials, they will ask like the administration, like if they're not willing to do really military stop such a Turkish invasion, that at least they will do like some serious sanctions to stop Turkey from coming in. But I think they will probably be a little bit more relaxed when the Biden administration comes, because I think they will also hope to see figures that were working with them under the Obama administration in the fight against ISIS. Although that's still unclear. But I mean, I think personally they will feel quite comfortable with this administration, also because you saw the public position of Biden during the presidential campaign towards Turkey. You also see Turkey now sort of before the transition, like soften its tone a little bit. So I mean, there's like maybe a little hope that maybe there could be more peace, and the SDF was also constantly saying that like we don't want to have issues with Turkey. And of course, also one of the reasons that there's this Kurdish talks is also like one of the reasons is also like that it's a sort of indirect dialogue with Turkey. That's why you have like General Mazlum's talking about like removing certain cadros, as they call them, PKK cadros from Syria. So this is like sort of also a way to see if they can make some form of reconciliation with Turkey, but not directly, but through like these talks with the Kurdish National Council, which is part of the Turkish-backed opposition and also backed here by the Kurdistan regional government. So it's like sort of a way to see if they can also soften Turkish position. Although publicly Turkey was very aggressive towards these talks, but the last few months we haven't heard much from Turkey on this specific issue. And also you should not forget that the NKSE recently went to Turkey to talk with also Western diplomats there in Turkey, but also I guess with the Turks. So I think the Turks are also informed about the status of this negotiation. So I think it's sort of an indirect, not dialogue, but maybe something also an indirect message to Turkey to see.
It's like a back channel.
Yeah, sort of a back channel, but because also this is also because of the regime is not very serious in its negotiations, and they're always afraid that, for instance, Russia could make, for instance, deal with Turkey again, like under the table, like okay, we give you some stuff in Idlib. The Turks kind of
did hand over Manbij not long ago too.
Yeah, well, Manbij is still under SDF control. I mean, it's just there's just some regime points there, but it's still the city and everything is still under SDF. But I mean, there's always this fear of that there could be like some deal between the Russians and the Turks, because they were talking about that before. For instance, during Euphrates Shields, there was a sort of Russian approval. Also later during Afrin operation, there were some deals, green buses coming to Afrin, bringing rebel families to Afrin from areas that the regime defeated the opposition. So there's always this sort of fear that there's a possibility. And also you still have the Sochi and the Astana meetings, talks. So, I mean, yeah.
So in my last episode, I spoke to Abdullah Hawez in London, and we talked about the relationship between Turkey, the Iraqi Kurds, and the PKK recently. and he was suggesting that the different one of the differences is that Turkey has long had better relations with the KDP, Kurdish Democratic Party, and the KRG administration, and they have a shared interest against the PKK. But he also suggested that there would be no way to solve some of the problems in Syria without some of these intra-Kurdish discussions and be able to solve these issues together rather than in, as he phrased it, like the U.S. policy of trying to deal with it country by country. So when Rayburn, according to the State Department announcement, he was in Deir ez-Zor to speak to the tribal leaders and broker some of these intra-Kurdish talks. What is the progress with these talks? What are some of the difficulties that these different Kurdish parties are facing in reaching an understanding?
Well, I mean, it's not something new that these talks happened in the past. I mean, there was the so-called Erbil agreement, the Duhok agreement, and now they're trying to reach the Kamishli agreement, so an agreement inside Syria, which is better to do it inside Syria rather than in Duhok or in Erbil. But I mean, there are several obstacles, and the obstacles is basically, I mean, the SDF, the YPG, the PYE, they play this big role in the fight against ISIS and they control all this territory. And like the NKC, which is the Kurdish National Council, which is backed by the KDP and the KRG, they really were sort of marginalized. So they were completely out of the picture. So it's like quite difficult to find a new deal to include them in this administration, to reform this current administration that they have, which doesn't only include Kurds, also Arabs and Christians, because also it's very different from when it was the Erbil agreement, because in that time they controlled mostly Kurdish territories, also some Arab areas, but it was like very different from now that you have this administration of northeastern Syria with the tribes in Deir ez-Zor, Raqqa, etc. So you cannot just say, okay, Ankara, we're gonna do 50-50 or something with this whole administration. I mean, like it should be just for areas where Kurds are a majority. So it's a bit complicated. The NKC also, they deny, by the way, that they want to do 50-50, but it's a little bit complicated because the situation is quite different from 2012, 2014, because now they control such a large area. And also the other difference is that now there's really a US guarantor. There were some rumors that the US was also involved in talks in 2014, but 2012, it was like 2011, 2012, it was more like a Kurdish thing. There was not so much international actors involved in these negotiations. So now you have really a US guarantor. But the problem is like how to share power, basically. And then the most difficult issue is the military issue, because you have the Syrian Kurds that were basically trained by Iraqi Kurdish Peshmerga forces, more specifically the KDP, the Rojava Peshmerga. And like some name them like it's a big number, some people say it's a small number. But I've also saw them in battle against ISIS. So they're not such a small group. They're not as big as the SDF, because the SDF is like almost 100 to 120,000 fighters, if you not also include the internal security forces. So the SDF is quite big, but it's also going to be a complicated issue, like how you're going to deal with this military file, because that was always one of the main problems, because the YPG in the past was always saying you can only have one military force because we don't want to have the same problem what the Iraqi Kurds had, that you have this sort of de facto division into two zones, like one PUK zone, one KDP zone with different security forces. So they said we need one united security force because we don't want to have a civil war, what the Iraqi Kurds had in the 90s. But at the same time, you have different military entities of which are not completely YPG, that are sort of independent, that have some form of autonomy in the SDF. So I mean, there could also be always some form of a deal to find a solution to that issue. But I think the most problematic thing is like they have like sort of a joint agreement now on a joint vision. So they agree on some form of Kurdish rights, autonomy, etc. I mean, in that way, like their ideas are not so much different. They want to also have the NKC wants to also have a recognized autonomous system where the Kurds have their rights. They want to have Kurdish language, etc. But they have like a lot of differences, and also you have, of course, this external influence of Kurdish parties. So not only the Kurdish parties from Turkey, but also Kurdish parties from Iraq. So like I mean, the Syrian Kurds were always like sort of a small population, so they were always under influence from neighboring Kurds, let's say. So it's like quite difficult to find a solution, but also the aim of the talks is not to reach an agreement immediately in one day. Like they're still talking, and it could take still several months till, I mean, after even when the new administration is there. I mean, it's going to take time for there to be any agreement. It needs like a lot of like steps. So it's not like before. I think that's also the good thing about these talks, that they take their time, because in the Erbil under the Hoc agreement, the Kurds at that time, they were quite fast with making agreements, and then the problem was the implementation. So it's better to take a lot of time to talk about issues than rather than just solve, like have an agreement in 1 week and then like nothing is implemented. So it's like it's a process, and I mean, not many people are quite optimistic that this could work because of the political party differences, the ideology, the sharing of military and administrative power. But in the end, it's also a process. So but as also what Mr. Howard said, is that if you want to have a solution to this sort of intra-Kurdish talks, you need to also have a peace process in Turkey, because if there's not a peace process in Turkey, you always have another threat of a Turkish invasion. You always have fighting between the PKK and Turkey, which is putting pressure on KDP and the Iraqi Kurds to do something against the PKK, which is also automatically influencing the Kurdish talks, because you have this influence of the Kurdish parties from Iraq and Turkey on Kurdish parties in Syria. So it could negatively affect those talks. And you now also see that with the Sinjar agreement, that after the Sinjar agreement was with the role is to remove Hasid Shabi, PMF, and like PKK supported groups, that like then like the relations also start to affect also the Kurdish talks in Syria somehow, because remember that it was YPG and some PKK elements that basically were saving Yazidis in 2014 when they opened this humanitarian corridor from inside Syria. So yeah, like it's like everything is sort of interconnected, and the problem is often that you have like the US is working focused on Syria, you have a team for Syria, someone focused on Iraq, someone focusing on Turkey, but the trouble with Kurdish issue is not related to one country, it's related to several countries, and that's very difficult for certain governments in the area, that they don't have really a one Kurdish policy, because the Kurds are divided over 4 countries, so they deal with the Kurds separate from each other. But that doesn't work, because if you have Kurdish talks in Syria and you have a Sinjar agreement in Iraq, it's going to automatically be connected to each other. The same thing with the peace process in Turkey. When that breaks down, it negatively affects the fight against ISIS, because Turkey is attacking your partners in the area. So yeah, everything is sort of interconnected, and that's why any new administration, they should also think about the interconnectedness basically of this Kurdish issue, and that if you want to develop a policy, it's better to develop like a sort of a wholesome Kurdish issue policy, although it's quite difficult. I think there have been attempts also in State Department to have some like more coordination between different this country desks to focus on the Kurdish issue, but it's quite complicated. And also, I mean, at least with this administration, like the incoming president, the president-elect, he at least knows the Kurdish issue quite well. So it's not like someone like Trump who like one day say Kurds are good fighters, the next day they said they're bad fighters.
In World War II.
So it's like there's not like why they didn't participate in Normandy or something. I mean, there will not be such a weird discussion. Like Biden understands the situation very well. But I think also it was Yerevan Said in the Al Jazeera was also saying to basically writing sort of as a message also to Kurds not to expect too much from Biden, just because when he was a senator or he made some statements when he was not in
Iraq,
yeah, it doesn't mean like immediately that they're going to be like 100%. Like you also have to take in consideration for the US the interests of Iraq, of Turkey, and other countries. So yeah, we have to see how it's going to look like.
And we just seem to be getting at least some hints from even Biden's incoming team, some of the comments that they've made during the Trump years that seem to suggest a lot of familiarity with the topic. I think it was Jake Sullivan who suggested as a policy proposal that the U.S. would make a deal with Turkey where they would operate and try to continue to separate the PKK elements from the Syrian Kurds that they're working with, and then they would encourage Turkey to restart the peace process inside its own borders. Of course, that is challenged by the whole People's Alliance situation with the MHP, who do not seem to have any interest in that whatsoever. And then if General Austin is confirmed, ultimately gets his waiver and everything, then he also took his position at a point where the Pentagon was beginning to increase support for the Kurds. And in some of his testimony, he's been quite pro. He's been very supportive of that effort of arming the Kurds. So it does seem like the Biden team has some, of course, a much more improved understanding than the current president ever had when it came to this topic. So.
Yeah, I think obviously if there's really a genuine peace process again in Turkey, it's also easier to sort of separate the SDF from the PKK. I mean, you always have the ideological influence of Abdullah Öcalan because they follow this democratic confederalism autonomous model. But I mean, it will be always easier to do that basically. But I think the key thing is that you need this Kurdish overall policy, not just a Kurdish policy focused just on, for instance, Syria or Iraq. So I mean, there's ways to do that. But I think in general, like it would be much easier to work with Turkey and Syria if there's a peace process. But as you said, the AK Party, Erdogan, which is, although he's quite pragmatic, I mean, he could change his alliances any day, but currently he's quite dependent on this sort of like pro-Russian Euro-Asia generals in Turkish army, and then like MHP. So they're more like sort of people that look more like ultra-nationalistic. Turkish ultra-nationalistic, cross-border operations, this kind of stuff. So it's quite difficult to change this idea of the AK Party. But I mean, it's difficult to see how Erdogan will change his idea because, like, you have people like from, for instance, you have some people. There was an analyst from the Washington Institute. He was saying that Erdogan basically sees now that. After what happened, the military coup and everything, he was basically telling him in a meeting that, yeah, you know, like we're not going to go back to peace, you know, like we have our own Kurds in the AK Party, this kind of rhetoric. So it's quite difficult to see when you have thousands of people, if HDP is still in jail, and like every day they're like Erdogan's talking about some new.
That there's no Kurdish problem in Turkey.
Yeah, there's no Kurdish problem, and in the past Erdogan was more realistic. He was saying there was a Kurdish problem.
Yeah.
I mean, this is just something like claiming that there's no Palestinian issue in the Middle East. I mean, it still exists. I mean, there are other issues also. It's not the main issue in the Middle East, just as the Kurdish issue is not the only issue in the Middle East. So, I mean, that's a little bit the complication. But of course, you don't know, like maybe economically speaking, there could always be some sanction relief or this kind of thing. So sanctions are also a way to work on this kind of issues, possibly. So, I mean, like Turkey also needs to economically needs to improve its economy. So it could also have some incentives because peace is better for the economy than constant warfare and arresting people. I mean, like the securitization of Turkey is leading also to less trust in investment because people are not sure about the security environment in Turkey because there's all these arrests. Military, political tensions, etc. So, I mean, for Turkey economically to have more opening up, then it would probably be much better for Turkish economy. But it's difficult to convince Erdogan of such a thing. But of course, we don't know. Like he has a lot of challengers at the moment. But I mean, there are still no elections for the moment. So.
No, we have another 2 or 3 years before that happens, and in the meantime, it does seem like it's quite a tightrope that they're traveling because acting too strongly, whether it's in Syria or any of the other regions they've been involved with, they do seem very cognizant of some of these vulnerabilities. And you know, we do have that European meeting coming in the next 2 days or so where they can ultimately end up agreeing on sanctions related to the East Mediterranean too. So Turkey seems to have its plate full right now of things to consider.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I mean. Like they have all these tensions, not because they are not only have issues. Like before, you had this long time ago on the Davutoglu, they're saying like, yeah, we don't want to have any problems with anyone, and now basically they have problems with everyone, like almost all their neighbors. I mean, they have good relations with Azerbaijan. I mean, they have some good relations with the Iraqi Kurds still, although Turkey also opposed the Kurdish independence referendum. but they don't have that much. I mean, they have some. I mean, they have like this weird relationship also with Russia. I mean, that they're like have different alliances, but at the same time they make a deal all the time. So I mean, it is like quite difficult for Turkey to. That's why I also think it's a little bit unlikely that you will have another small Turkish intervention in northern Syria. But of course, you never know, because it's also a bad idea to just say you have just one scenario and this is what's going to happen, because often that doesn't work how it works in the world. I mean, there are always several scenarios that are possible. But yeah, I think it's quite interesting to see what we're going to see in the next few months.
I agree with you 100% on that. Wladimir, it's been a pleasure to have you on Turkey Abroad, and this is a topic that I really look forward to staying in touch with, and maybe having you on again soon for.
Yeah, no problem. That would be great.
Wladimir, thank you for joining me.
A good night or morning.
It's evening here. Good morning to you too, though.
Yeah.
My name is Nicholas Morgan, and this is Turkey Abroad.